You've had so much attention over this last couple of years, and I've been digging into the research and just been fascinated by everything that you've been up to. And I just love your stance on the vision you have for humanity.
You said you act as if God exists. Do you also act as if the devil exists? Man, I think I probably act even more as if the devil exists, because it's a lot, in some sense, it's a lot more easy for me, and I think it is for most people. It's easier for me to believe in the reality of malevolence and evil and to be terrified about that getting a grip on me than it is to be optimistic and naive about the possibility of transcendent good. It's just that it's not that I am skeptical about the reality of transcendent good. I mean, fundamentally, I believe that good is more powerful than evil. I do believe that, but there's something palpable about evil that's also undeniable. It's like, well, you can debate about whether or not heaven exists, and you can even be skeptical, but you can't debate about whether the Gulag Archipelago existed, and you can't debate about Auschwitz, and you can't debate about the fact that people's proclivity towards blindness and malevolence produced those horrors, and the horrors that people often encounter in their day-to-day world and in their relationships. So it's very easy for someone like me to be a believer in evil and to try to turn away from that. But through deep contemplation, I've come to the conclusion that the ability of human beings to turn away from evil and to pursue good is more powerful than malevolence itself. But that fills me with hope and awe, I guess is the right word, when I can bring it to mind and think that we can in fact defeat malevolence, but sort of on a moment-to-moment basis, the malevolence is so palpable and so real that it's a more powerful motivator for avoidance. I don't mean avoidance of responsibility. I mean avoidance of walking down that path. And I think that's probably in keeping with the well-known psychological doctrine that people are more loss averse than they are gain sensitive. So a loss of X, it upsets you more to lose $5 than it does make you happy to gain $5. That's a well-known psychological fact. And it's because we're more sensitive to punishment and negative emotion. And that's because, well, you can die in agony, but you can only be so happy. So, yes, I certainly act as if the devil exists, I would say. And I think I probably believed in the devil, so to speak, speaking metaphorically, before I believed in God. I became convinced of the reality of evil. And not only convinced of the reality of evil, but also convinced that everyone was destined to play their part in that, including me, and that it would be better if I played the least part in that as possible. And that sort of brings us back to this book. As Solzhenitsyn said, the line that divides good from evil runs down the heart of every individual. Right? It's an internal thing, it's not between states, it's not between groups. It's between elements of our psyche. And our individual responsibility is to work to ameliorate suffering and to constrain malevolence and to start with ourselves.
Why is there so much conflict in the world? Is it because there's so many different perceptions that people have on what they think should be right or what?
Sure. Well, part of it, of course, there's conflict because we have real problems. And so life is actually difficult, independent of psychological foolishness, let's say, independent of the obstacles that we put in our own path.
It's already challenging.
It's already fatally challenging, right? Life is the ultimate challenge.
We will die.
Yes. And
so there is a challenge, yeah.
Yes,
uncertainty, fear, pain, all those
things.
Yes,
everything that goes along with suffering is a challenge, and it's the full challenge because it takes everything you have. And so part of the reason we disagree is because there are complex problems to solve, and then we also disagree because we're willfully blind and because we're more ignorant than we should be, and we're not everything we should be, and we tilt towards malevolence from time to time, and we betray each other and ourselves, and so we take a bad lot in many ways and make it worse. Now, not always, obviously, and we don't have to, but that's sort of the baseline that we're working against. I think people are most disappointed in life when they're disappointed in themselves. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life, and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that, and they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. Suffering is pain, and the suffering is anxiety and uncertainty, and the suffering is hopelessness. But the consequence of all that is that you get bitter. And when you get bitter, you get mean and you get cruel, and you start to hurt yourself and other people. You might think, well, here's some things that people need in their life, because your life is not going to be solid, grounded, gratifying, acceptable, meaningful, relevant, and devoid of earth-shaking anxiety without managing some of these things. Most people need an intimate relationship, a long-term intimate relationship, because otherwise they get lonesome and bored and crazy. Crazy in a different way than you get if you have a long-term relationship. Worse crazy. They need friends. They need family. So that could be your birth family, your parents, your extended family, your siblings, but also children. So you need to know, well, where does that fit in your life? What's your vision for that? So it's not only that if you don't have a goal, you suffer. It's that if you don't have a goal, you suffer, and then you get cruel and bitter and resentful, and then you start to actively try to make the world a worse place. And so because you can't suffer pointlessly without becoming bitter, and you can't become bitter without becoming cruel. So you need an aim. The question, of course, is what you should aim.
Better aim.
Yeah, better aim. That's for sure. So then the question is, what should your aim be?
The question comes back to, after, someone could go down the rabbit hole and say, why am I doing this? And why is this, meaningful for me? And I think a lot of people go back to, well, why am I here in the first place?
Yes.
Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life? And is this real? Or is this just some dream world?
Well, and then people do go back to that.
And then they get stuck on that.
Yeah. But
none of this even matters, because why am I even here?
Well, the thing is that that's a self-defeating set of propositions in some sense, because the consequence of being stuck there, the reason you're stuck there to begin with is because you're not very happy about the fact that life is intrinsically tied up with suffering, because you wouldn't be asking that question to begin with. Okay, so if you let that pull you in and take you down, all it does is make the suffering worse.
Absolutely.
It's not helpful. And then the cascade that we talked about happens. You suffer stupidly and pointlessly. You get bitter, you get cruel, you make everything worse. It's like, that's your answer, is it? You're going to make everything worse. It's bad enough, you're going to make it worse. Mostly people won't do that consciously.
Yes.
So you think, well, what's the alternative? Well, here's one. If you have a sufficiently noble purpose, the suffering will justify itself. And I think that's empirically testable.
And the final question is, what's your definition of greatness?
Well, greatness is what reveals itself when you attempt to formulate, when you attempt to carefully articulate and live out what you believe to be true. It just happens, because there isn't anything more powerful than truth, right? That's the antidote to suffering, truth, right? So it's a strange thing, because you think, well, yeah, it produces a lot of suffering too. It's like, yeah, in the short term.
Yeah.
So, yeah. My daughter's school is now teaching gender as a social construct. 4 sexes. Avoids naming boys and girls.
Tonight, parents had the chance to read through several textbooks aimed at meeting new state standards.
They could then decide for themselves if there's a place in their child's curriculum for the material.
California law now says contributions from LGBT people and certain cultural groups must be included in public school curriculum.
I want to make sure that it's age appropriate, and I want to know what is going to be taught to my child.
So Elk Grove Unified School District is cracking open the pages and letting parents take a look at the lessons before they hit the classrooms. But Greg Burt with the California Family Council has some objections.
Did they research who these heroes were?
On the page with Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln, the name Jose Julio Soria, widely believed to be the first openly gay person to run for public office. This second grade textbook writes about him saying he decided to be honest. He told people he was gay and that sometimes he dressed as a woman. He was the first person to do this when running for office. It inspired other gay leaders to run for office too.
I just don't think Elk Grove parents are ready or interested in having their second graders learn honesty from a drag queen who has a criminal record.
According to a New York Times article, Soria was arrested on morals charges in 1947 in a public bathroom at the St. Francis Hotel. Mom of three, Carrie Harrell,
I am not anti-LGBT. I love all people.
says she's simply concerned about teachers discussing sexuality with her 7-year-old.
It needs to be dealt with appropriately.
And it's not just Elk Grove. Several schools across California are looking at these new standards.
What do? Leaving is not an option. I mean, look, to some degree, what people define as gender is a social construct. So let's look at it this way. So there are things that make men men and that make women women that are universal across cultures. So let's say, except for tiny variations, external genitalia. So, but then there are things that do vary across culture with regards to whether they're regarded as masculine or feminine, or male or female, and those are more learned. So let's say that external genitalia is not a social construct. It's not learned. If we can't agree on that, then we're not going to be able to have a discussion at all. So, but there are some things about male behavior and some things about female behavior that are culture specific and learned. And so to that degree, gender is a social construct. So, you have to give the devil his due. But the problem isn't teaching that gender is a social construct. The problem is teaching that gender is only a social construct, and that's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. As soon as someone's doing that, then you know that you're dealing with an ideologue. And the research evidence on that, for example, is crystal clear, apart from the fact that there are morphological differences between men and women, which are quite obvious. You can name a variety of them. Men have wider jaws, they have larger teeth, they can bite harder, they have thicker skulls, as women certainly can attest to. From a psychological perspective, they are more powerful in the upper body, they can punch a lot harder, they can throw more naturally. They tend to weigh more, they tend to be taller. That's sexual dimorphism. Human beings are relatively sexually dimorphic as far as primates and other mammals go. There's difference in obviously waist to hip ratio. Women's elbows are at a different angle. They have finer bones. Women have a subcutaneous layer of body fat that men don't have. Women are a little bit more pain resistant, more pain tolerant. They also have very high levels of stamina. Women tend to have a little edge in verbal ability. Men tend to have a little edge in spatial ability. And then there are, apart from the straight physiological differences, there are psychological differences. There's a variety of them. Women are more enthusiastic. Men are more assertive. That's extroversion. Women are higher in withdrawal and in volatility. That's on the neuroticism front. Women are more agreeable and more polite. That's on the agreeableness front. Men are more industrious slightly, and women are more orderly. That's on the conscientious front. And women are higher in openness proper, and men are higher in interest in ideas, and that's on the openness front. And those differences aren't huge. There's more overlap between the genders, the sexes, than there is lack of overlap, but the differences magnify at the extremes. And they also maximize in societies that are egalitarian. And then the biggest difference between men and women that we know of psychologically is that men are more prone to be interested in things and women are more prone to be interested in people. And that's actually quite a large difference by psychological standards. And there isn't any evidence that that is socially constructed. The counter evidence is that as you make societies more egalitarian, those differences actually get bigger rather than smaller. And even the London Times 3 weeks ago wrote an editorial describing yet another study that demonstrated that. So that's like 6, and they're huge scale studies, pointing out that the fact that the differences between men and women get bigger in more egalitarian societies is now one of the most well-established findings in all of the social sciences, thus demonstrating, for example, that poor James Damore was correct, despite the fact that Google fired him for being accurate in his analysis of the scientific literature.